we're going to talk about a specific part of logical assessment, which is trying to assess whether an argument is deductively valid. Please be reminded that argument assessment contains two steps. You might call it the critical thinker's two-step, like it is a little dance, right? So first you do one step, then two-step. It's 1-2 step, right? Be reminded that you have to do a critical thinker two-step. So before you can get to the actual business of assessing whether you think parts of an argument are factually correct, so whether the premises are actually true, you first have to check whether there's an actual logical connection between the premises and the conclusion. Because if that connection is absent, there's no point in checking the truth value of the premises, right? That might be a connection of certainty. So the connection of certainty between the premises and the conclusion is that if these premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true, is guaranteed to be true. That way you show that there is a logical connection between the truth of the premises and that of the conclusion. Could also be the case that there's a connection of probability, right? Of inductive force, as the book calls it. So if the premises are true, would be true, then the conclusion would be more likely to be true than not true. In both cases, we're not talking about the actual truth of the premises. No, we're talking about the connection between the premises and the conclusion. One way of thinking about it is imagining the premises and the conclusion as different cogs in a machine, or cogs in a machine that should be connected. So what your question then actually is, if you're doing that first step in the critical thinker's two-step, is that if P1 and P2 start turning, will the conclusion start turning as well? So are they connected or not? So we're not really checking the truth of the premises or the propositions, we're looking at the connection between them. And that's difficult to do because we're intuitive, as we've seen last week when we discussed the belief bias, we're very intuitive in assessing arguments on the basis of, do we think the propositions are true? Do we think the conclusion is true? Well, we first have to check whether they are actually connected, and that's more difficult. So let's look at a couple of examples by what I mean by looking at the connections between the premises and the conclusion. So let's say somebody says to you, if Elvis lives, he'd study SSR. Elvis lives, Elvis would study SSR. That would be a valid argument. We think it's valid because if premise 1 and premise 2 were true, the conclusion would have to be true. I use a silly example because even though we know that Elvis doesn't live, that's not relevant for checking the validity of the argument. Again, we're looking at the structure, the connection between the premises, right? So what we have to check is whether, if we assume the premises to be true, would the conclusion have to be true, to which the answer is yes in this case. The second argument differs somewhat from the first one. If Elvis lives, he'd study SSR. Elvis probably lives. Elvis would study SSR. The difference between the two is that the connection implied by the second premise between the premises and the conclusion is less strong than in the first instance. We're not allowed to say that given that the premises are true, the conclusion would have to be necessarily true. No, we're saying given that the premises are true, the conclusion is more likely to be true than not. If we're allowed to conclude that the conclusion is more likely to be true than not, given that the premises are true, we say that an argument is inductively forceful. These are the two ways in which we check the connection between premises and conclusions. So we're not looking at the actual truth of the premises, we're looking at the connection between the premises and the conclusion, which is the most important part for now. We're going to get back to inductive force during the Friday lecture. So here's another silly example just to show you that the actual truth value of the premises is irrelevant for judging validity. So Tap Dance Tuesday is a Dutch national holiday. Today is Tap Dance Tuesday. Today is a Dutch national holiday. So if we assume there's no such thing as Tap Dance Tuesday, it's not a Dutch national holiday today, but if we assume that premise 1 and premise 2 were actually true, we would have to conclude that the conclusion is true, which makes this argument valid. And I've made the same change to look at inductive force in the second example. So Tap Dance Tuesday takes place on a Friday. Today is probably Tap Dance Tuesday. Today it's Friday. We don't know for sure that today is Friday, but we know that it's more probable than not that it's Friday, given that the premises were true. All right. What we're doing all this time is checking for the connections between the premises and the conclusion. We're checking for deductive validity. If the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. And we're checking for inductive force. For this lecture, we're going to focus more on that deductive validity, assessing deductive validity. So, you've seen nonsensical examples, right? I told you that, or there's a premise saying that Tap Dance Tuesday takes place on a Friday. It's weird stuff. I made it weird stuff just to make sure you focus on the connection between the premises, not the actual truth value of the premises. Because that's what we're doing. That's the first step in that critical thinker's two-step. First checking the connections, then checking the contents. Right? All right. And we're going to do that by looking at deductive validity, which is one way of gauging the connection between the premises and the conclusion. That's a useful thing to do if you need to assess a deductive argument. So it's a useful skill to learn and recognize when a deductive argument is used. That is not often the case in how people usually argue and try to communicate with each other. Sometimes it is. So if we're talking about logical equations or mathematical equations, then of course a deductive logic is implied. And sometimes people really stress their degree of conviction that the conclusion has to be true given that the premises are true. So they're very strong in saying, in their word choice, they're saying that it's certain, given that this and this is the case, it's certain that that and that is the case. From this, it logically follows that the conclusion should be true, or this shows conclusively that. So those indicator words can be used to recognize whether somebody is intending to make a deductively valid argument, so you can assess it as such. And there are other indicator words for an inductive argument. It's also useful to recognize common reasoning forms. So what type of arguments people try to construct in certain cases. It's not that useful for this course, at least, to say I'm only assessing deductive validity if somebody intends to make a deductive argument, or I'm only assessing an inductive force if somebody tries to make an inductive argument. What we're doing, because we're applying charity, is that when assessing an argument, we also always first check for deductive validity, and if it's invalid, we also check then for inductive force. So we're doing both. It's useful to know that deductive arguments usually imply safe inferences, right? Because all the information contained in the conclusion is present in the premises as well. That's what it means for it to be deductively valid, is that the conclusion is guaranteed to be true, or if the premises were true, it's impossible for the conclusion to be not true, which means that it's in a way a bit of a boring argument, right? Because everything in the conclusion was present in the premises as well. People often say that a deductive argument, or at least a deductive inference, is where you go from a general principle to a specific instance, like from a theory to a hypothesis. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case, right? So that would be an example of the inverse being the case. So I start with a specific premise. Something was the case in a specific period of time in the year 2001, and from that I make a more general, draw a more general conclusion. What is important in inductive arguments is that you recognize that people are trying to say that the conclusion is guaranteed to be true given that the premises are true. Whether we go from specific instances to general descriptions or the other way around is of secondary importance. An inductive argument is more exciting because well, the conclusion, if it were true, adds something of information to the premises, right? That creates that uncertainty. So not all the information from the premises is present in the conclusion to a full extent, which is what makes it a more risky inference. And in the same way that deductive arguments not only will not always imply reasoning from general instances to specific instances, inductive arguments can work both ways as well. So, for example, if I start with a general sequence, all of J.K. Rowling's books so far have been good, so that's a more general description than the prediction in the conclusion. From that, I conclude with some certainty, or with some degree of certainty, that the next book by the same author will probably be good, right? Here I'm reasoning from a general description to a specific prediction. So what I'm trying to say is, don't be confused by what you've heard so far about the empirical cycle, that it's always from general description to specific, then it's deductive. But what we're focusing on is something else. What we're trying to focus on is the arguer trying to convince you that if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true, is guaranteed to be true. Well, then again, it becomes a matter of identifying those deductive arguments by using the words, by identifying the different words that people might use in the instance that they're trying to give a deductively valid argument. You could recognize common reasonings forms that we're going to talk about in a while. And it actually doesn't matter that much for SSR because we're being charitable in our assessment of arguments. So if somebody gives an argument, even if they intended to make a deductively valid argument, or it's somewhat ambiguous whether they went for an inductively valid or a inductively forceful or deductively valid argument, we'll first assess whether it's deductively valid, and then if it's not deductively valid, we'll still try to assess inductive force. All right, so what we're talking about so far is, if we're trying to assess deductive validity, is the first step in this diagram. So all we're doing when doing an assessment of an argument is first logical assessment, which means checking if the conclusion must be true if the premises were true, and if that's not the case, we'll check for inductive force, which means checking whether if the premises are true, is the conclusion more likely to be true than not. If neither is the case, then we're done with our assessment, and we have to conclude that it's neither valid nor forceful, so there's no use for actually checking whether the premises can be considered to be true, right? So everything on the first level is part of that logical assessment, is part of that first step of the critical thinker's two-step. The next step, if it is indeed the case that the argument is deductively valid, is checking whether the premises are in fact true. If the premises are in fact true, then we can say that the argument is valid as well as sound, or as the book describes it, it's deductively sound, which means the same thing. Deductively sound. Deductive soundness means that I first checked for validity, that was the case, then I checked for soundness, that was the case as well, so I'm calling it deductively sound. If it is valid but it isn't sound, you can call it valid but unsound. The same applies. So if the answer to the first question is no, the conclusion is not necessarily true if the premises were true, then you go to the second question on that logical assessment level. And you ask yourself the question, is the conclusion likely to be true, given that the premises are true? If the answer to that is yes, you're going to that factual assessment level, and then you're going to check whether the premises are in fact true. If the premises are indeed in fact true, then you can say it's a inductively forceful argument and it's sound, or you can summarize that, as the book does, by saying it's inductively sound, which means the same thing. Inductive, you say it's inductively forceful and I consider it to be sound. If the premises aren't factually true, you say it's forceful but it's unsound. All right, does that answer your question?
Yes.
All right, excellent, thanks. So those are all the steps we're taking, and for now we're focusing on that first step. So how do you assess whether something is valid or not, deductively valid or not? Well, an argument, as I mentioned a couple of times, is valid if it's impossible that all the premises are true, but that the conclusion is not. So the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. And again, we're talking about the form of the argument, like the gears in that machine. So in this example, Donald Trump looks decidedly orange. Only oranges and carrots look decidedly orange. Donald Trump is an orange or a carrot would be valid even if we know that to be untrue. If I would tell you Donald Trump looks decidedly like an orange, only oranges and carrots look decidedly orange, Donald Trump is a carrot, that wouldn't be a valid argument, right? Because we know if premise 2 were true and premise 1 is true, so we know he looks orange, and we know that only these two that it's either an orange or a carrot if he looks orange, then we know that he is a carrot or an orange. We don't know for sure that he is a carrot, so that would make it invalid. And that's basically what we're checking when we're checking deductive validity. That's difficult because, as we said before, you're confused by sometimes by the fact that you know some premises to be true or nonsensical. So if I say, look at the first argument, if I get the grade of a 10 for SSR, Roland dances the Macarena, I got a 10 for SSR, Roland dances the Macarena, that argument is valid, because if the premises were true, the conclusion would hold, is guaranteed to be true. Even though, obviously, that first premise is false if we do a factual assessment. That's what I indicate within brackets, right? The book uses the same practice to indicate that this premise is actually false, and this premise is actually true, and this conclusion is actually true. Just to show you that even if an argument contains a false premise, you can still say that it's valid, because if we assume that the premises are true, the conclusion would have to hold. Let's look at the next example. If I get an 11 for SSR, Roland dances the Macarena, I got an 11 for SSR, so Roland dances the Macarena. Here we could assume the first premise to be true. I'm telling you this. I will dance the Macarena for you if you get an 11 for this course. That's a true statement. So we can assess that first premise to be factually correct. But it's impossible for you to get an 11 for SSR. So you know that the second premise is factually incorrect. It doesn't matter if we look at deductive validity, because then we assume the premises to be true, and if we assume the premises to be true, would the conclusion have to hold? Yes, in this case, again, the conclusion would have to hold. We can make it even more ridiculous by saying that all bananas are secret space shuttles, which is clearly a false statement. Tequila is a banana, which is clearly a false statement again, and then conclude that tequila is a secret space shuttle. It's a valid argument. If the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true, which is what we're trying to assess. The fact that it's all nonsense doesn't really matter. We're trying to check for the connections between the nonsense. All right, so a valid argument can contain premises that are not true and conclusions that are not true. What it cannot contain is premises that are in fact true, but a conclusion that is not. So, for example, if I get a 10 for SSR, Roland dances the Macarena, I got a 10 for SSR, Roland does not dance the Macarena. Right? Again, if we assume the premises to be true, the conclusion would have to be true. That the conclusion that I do dance the Macarena would have to hold. So saying that I don't would make this argument invalid. That's basically all I can say about what deductive validity entails. We're looking at the connection between the premises and the conclusion, and what we're specifically checking is whether we assume the premises to be true, does the conclusion necessarily hold or not? If it necessarily has to be true. If the premises were true, we're saying it's valid, deductively valid. If that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, then we're saying it's not deductively valid.